Earlier this morning, we got a massive report that came out that ties the Las Vegas Raiders to Matthew Stafford, and apparently there's a real chance that it could actually end up happening. And when you really consider what the Raiders have right now as a football team, what the Raiders have in terms of the head coach, the offensive coordinator, what the Raiders have as a general franchise where they're kind of at, a quarterback can really put this team, in contention, in my opinion. Of course, they got to fix a couple of things, which, you look at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers a couple years back, they're in a very similar spot, and they went out and fixed some of those things, and they ended up winning. And John Spytek saw that firsthand. And could the Raiders actually do the same thing with a guy like Matthew Stafford? So a report came out earlier today from Albert Breer where he basically had a couple of different thoughts and opinions that he kind of put out there, some things he had basically heard. One of those being the Matthew Stafford situation. And I kind of want to just jump right into this and show you guys, or share with you guys exactly what he said. So in this report, he's basically going to put it out there that during the week leading up to the Super Bowl, Stafford's camp got permission from the Rams to talk to other teams, right? So basically, the Los Angeles Rams said to Matthew Stafford, go ahead, go out there, do your thing, figure out what other teams are willing to pay you, and let us know which team you want to ultimately go to, and we'll essentially make that happen, right? So apparently, Matthew Stafford's reps had already had 2 weeks to test the market and see who would be willing to give up a trade compensation and a big new contract to land the 37-year-old. So essentially what they're looking for is which team is willing to give up whatever it is that the Rams want, plus a brand new contract for Matthew Stafford. Now, if you guys don't know this, the report that's actually out there, right, and multiple insiders other than Albert Breer have also put this out there. So last year, the Rams were basically trying to lock in Stafford for, 3-4 years, and they weren't able to come to a conclusion with the money aspect of it. Apparently, Matthew Stafford wanted more money, right, than what the Rams could apparently offer him, and the Rams did not have that salary cap. If you guys remember a couple years back, the Rams went all in, and they wanted to win a Super Bowl, and they won a Super Bowl, right? But with that, they also had some cap issues that had kind of arisen from that time, and it kind of got carried into the future, and of course, the Rams continuously tried to win a Super Bowl, right? Like, they continuously went all in, and they're at the point now where they can't pay Matthew Stafford what he wants. He apparently wants north of $50 million, and those are the official reports that have been put out there. But regardless of that, right, Albert Breer also kind of threw it in there saying the teams you'd suspect would have their hand in the ring have indeed thrown their hats in the ring. The New York Giants, the Cleveland Browns, the Pittsburgh Steelers, the Las Vegas Raiders, and others have shown interest. What's hard to know, though, is what the Rams would be willing to take to part with Stafford. Let's talk about this, right? So Albert Breer is basically putting it out there that the Raiders are one of the 5 or 6 teams who have reached out and have inquired about this. And there's one other source, I think it was Peter Schrager of the NFL Network. I think his last name Schrager. Don't quote me on that. I forget his name. But he's another guy that also talked about this morning. He put out an entire video, 3-4 minutes talking about it. But he basically put the same report out there in his own twist, right? And he basically said the Raiders were one of the teams that reached out. And I think he might have said the Giants and the Steelers were the other 2 teams. And I think he said it was like 3 teams specifically. And the Raiders were one of those teams. So what's interesting about this report is there's a real chance the Raiders might look to take this approach where he's saying, where they're saying we're going to go all in with Matthew Stafford and we're going to try to win a ring in the next 2 to 4 years, right? We're going to try to compete for a Super Bowl. We know what Matthew Stafford is as a quarterback. And on top of knowing what he is as a quarterback, we feel we can have success with that guy leading this franchise. One of the things we have to realize, and I hope people really understand this concept, teams draft quarterbacks based off of potential. They'll draft quarterbacks if it's the right year to draft quarterbacks. And we've seen years, especially recently, where teams are like, we're not taking quarterbacks, right? Where even though Hendon Hooker's ranked as the 2nd or 3rd best quarterback, we're not taking him in the 1st round, no matter what happens. Will Evans, we're not taking him, right? Even though he showed a little bit of upside. And teams are a lot more hesitant now than they've ever been to take quarterbacks. And I don't see that changing at all because there's quarterbacks like Matthew Stafford and Kirk Cousins and Derek Carr and Dak Prescott that are or might become available at some point. And it doesn't make sense to go all in on a rookie quarterback when you can, as a roster, get better, right? If you have a top 7 or 8 pick and you don't get QB1 or QB2, it doesn't make sense to take QB3, right? It makes more sense to take defensive end 1 or offensive tackle 1 and get that franchise guy at a different position. It just doesn't make sense, right? You're better off skipping out on a quarterback you're not 100% sure with, sucking for another year, coming back the following year, and ultimately drafting a quarterback, right? And this is one of those years where the quarterback class does not look good. Right? Every day we're hearing reports like, hey, this quarterback's QB1, this quarterback's QB1. And the reason that's happening is because no one really knows. Right? Cam Ward, most people do kind of agree, is the best quarterback in this class. He's the only quarterback worthy of a first-round pick. And then people are saying that outside of that, like Jackson Dart might be a top 10 pick. People are saying Shedeur Sanders might be a top 10 pick. But people are also saying we wouldn't touch these guys in the top, 2 rounds. Right? And there's other guys as well. Louisville quarterback Tyler Stow, I think that's how you say his name, is another guy that's kind of been trending upwards, right? To me, it doesn't make sense unless you somehow get Cam Ward, which I don't see him not being the first overall pick. Unless you don't get Cam Ward, unless you get Cam Ward, it doesn't make sense to take a quarterback at this point if you're the Raiders. But it could make sense to say, let's go in with Matthew Stafford. Now, it is fair to point out that Matthew Stafford wants $50 million. And for the Raiders, are you willing to pay him that type of money? Right? Could the Raiders even actually make it work? You look at the Las Vegas salary cap. Right now, the Raiders do have $99.5 million. This is based off of over the cap. Keep in mind, the Raiders have 54 players on their active roster. Some of this does include guys that are like practice squad players. Some of this includes guys that are probably not going to be on the roster next year, right? They're guys that will end up getting cut at some point. But also keep in mind, the Raiders have a ton of free agents that they got to kind of pay, right? So you got 27 guys here that are essentially pending free agents. I think there's like 11 starters here. So the Raiders are going to have to replace those guys for sure. But they do have $99.5 million. So the cap flexibility for the Raiders is definitely there, right? There's so much they can do as they kind of go forward. John Spytek can build this out however he wants. And we have some key players under contract, right? Don't overlook the fact that Christian Wilkins, Maxx Crosby are essentially locked in for the next... Maxx is locked in for 2 more seasons, although he wants a contract raise and even a potential extension. He's not going anywhere, and then Christian Wilkins is under contract for, I think, 3 or 4 more years. So the Raiders have some of these guys, key guys, locked in. Colton Miller's another guy that's locked in, right? The Raiders have some pieces, right? All they got to really do is figure out which guys need to be released, which guys you're going to save money on, and which free agents could potentially help you kind of get over that top, right? There's guys out there like Trey Smith, Mekhi Becton that could help you shore up that guard position. This draft is also very, very, very deep. And I love the idea of saying, let's go all in and try to win a Super Bowl this year. Right? Because, if you think about where the Raiders are as a roster, you have those key pieces in place, but you got to add. And the thing is if you bring in Matthew Stafford. Now, here's the thing with Matthew Stafford. I'm not giving up a first-round pick. I'm probably not even giving up a second-round pick. Especially given where he's at in his age and the fact that he's not going to go back to the Rams unless the Rams pay him, right? And at this point, if the Rams were going to pay him, they would have paid him last year when the issue first had arisen last year. To me, if I'm the Raiders, you can bring in Matthew Stafford, keep the 6th overall pick, keep your 2nd round pick, and even your 3rd round pick, and that's 3 quality starters right there. So think about what the Raiders can do. You have that 6th overall pick. You can take the best wide receiver. Maybe that's Travis Hunter. Maybe that's Tetra McMillan. Maybe that's Luke Burden. You can add the best wide receiver in this class with pick 6. And then that gives you that best wide receiver with Brock Bowers. You have a good left tackle. You have a good center. You have a guy at the right tackle position that may or may not be the guy, but you still have him in place. You can bring in a free agent guard. You can draft a guard in the 2nd or 3rd round, and you can bring in a running back. And to me, imagine the Raiders having a guy like Amarian Hampton or Caleb Johnson in the backfield. They have Brock Bowers, they have Michael Mayer, you have Jacoby, Trey Tucker, and then you have Travis Hunter as your wide receiver 1. Right? To me, that's a very, very, very good offense. And that doesn't include the fact that you have Maxx and Christian on the defensive side. If those guys are healthy, if Tyree Wilson actually takes a year 3 leap, which I think he can actually do this year, he just has to be a little bit more consistent. Maybe you bring back Malcolm. Maybe you bring back Trayvon Merrick. Maybe you bring back Robert Spillane, right? You bring back the guys who need to. And again, you have $99 million to kind of make that happen, right? Now, it will be kind of difficult to do, especially considering that Matthew Stafford apparently wants $50 million. And I think that's going to be a big part of what the Raiders are going to have to really figure out. Can they pay this guy $50 million a year? Of course, if the Raiders did bring him in, I would hope that it's like a 3-year contract. Let's say the Raiders pay him an average of $50 million, exactly $50 million for 3 years. Essentially, the way you would make that work is in this first year, you would say, hey, instead of counting $50 million against the cap in year one. This year, it'll be $25 million against the cap. In year two, instead of it counting $50 million against the cap, we'll put it at 35, right? In year three, we'll put it at 45, right? And then essentially what you do is you add 2 void years. So there's 2 years that Matthew Stafford won't be here, and he'll count $25 million against the cap in 2 years that he's not here. So for 5 years, you're going to have to, basically take cap hits for Matthew Stafford. But the 3 years he's here, the cap hits will be lower, right? And you will have some dead cap, in year 4 or 5. But what that does is, for the Raiders, that makes you a team that can compete, right? It makes you a team that could absolutely try to win the Super Bowl. And that's in the Pete Carroll era, right? We got to realize Pete Carroll's not going to be here for 10 years. It's not going to happen. Pete Carroll is going to be here for 3 or 4 years, and there's going to be some sort of successor to Pete Carroll. Whether that's Patrick Graham, whether that's, Rob Leonard, we don't really know who it's going to be. Whether that's Chip Kelly, right? Someone's going to succeed Pete Carroll at some point. And I don't think Pete Carroll's going to be here for 10 years. I think he's more likely to be here for 3, max 4 years, and then he's ultimately going to end up retiring, and someone else is going to take over. But the hope is, Pete Carroll's not coming here to, hey, I'm going to build a team for success in 5 years. Pete Carroll's going to build a team to win a Super Bowl in the next 3 years, and you can't do that, at least in my opinion, if you take a quarterback with that 6th overall pick this year. Because you still have a need at wide receiver, you'll still have that need at running back, at guard, and in order to get those positions right, you got to use that 6th overall pick, especially at wide receiver, especially at cornerback, if that's the ultimate decision you decide to make, right? There's a couple of really good cornerbacks that are going to go in the top 10. But to me, the Raiders got to put those investments in, and trading away those picks or using them on a quarterback doesn't make sense, right? So can the Raiders actually bring in Matthew Stafford? I think it could happen. It looks like the Rams are realistically moving off of him, and it looks like the Raiders are actually looking at the veteran quarterback market, and that's the right way to do it. I cannot state this enough. The Raiders got to get a veteran quarterback. It doesn't make sense going with the rookie, especially in this year's class, where the Raiders are like the 14th picking that might take a quarterback. So to me, it just doesn't make sense. You could take a quarterback in like round 3 or 4 if you want to develop a guy. Maybe you can even let Aiden O'Connell develop behind Matthew Stafford. I like that plan a lot as well. But we'll see what ends up happening, right? And another thing you can do if you're the Raiders is, Sean McVay wants a quarterback. You trade with Matthew Stafford, you're going to need another quarterback. Maybe you ship off Gardner Minshew or Aiden O'Connell, right? And I'm not saying those guys are going to win the Super Bowl with Sean McVay, but Sean McVay has this ability to make quarterbacks have success. Sean McVay, I think he's one of those guys that's a really, really, really good coach. And I think Gardner Minshew would have a lot more success with Sean McVay. I think Aiden O'Connell would have a lot more success with Sean McVay. And that would be a short-term option for them, so just kind of package that in. I think a second-round pick should be more than enough. I would hope that if the Raiders do it, the second-round pick is next year's pick and not this year's pick, which I think the Rams would probably prefer anyways, because I think the report is the Rams want to move off of Matthew Stafford and then wait 1 year and take a quarterback in next year's class, right? That was the report that had come out. And with that, the Rams are looking for picks for next year's class. That way they can take those picks, package it up, and then hopefully be able to kind of move up and get their quarterback. And I think that's the right way for the Rams at this point. But for the Raiders, I think it would be smart to go all in and try to win a Super Bowl in the next 2 to 3 years. I also want to state this. The Eagles won a Super Bowl against the Chiefs this past Super Bowl because of their defensive line. Now, their offense did a really good job over the course of the season. They had success, right? Saquon Barkley ran for over 2,000 yards. They had a lot of success, but they won the Super Bowl because of the defensive line, right? And everybody knows that. Everybody saw it. So one of the things with the Raiders that I think is obviously a strength is that defensive line. And I don't think our defensive line is that much different than the Eagles' defensive line. Now, obviously, the Eagles have Jalen Carter as their main guy. We have Maxx Crosby as our main guy. So they have a D tackle. We have a D end. It's a little bit different. But then we have Christian Wilkins on the inside, who's pretty damn good as well. And the Eagles have, you can say maybe it's Josh Sweat. Some people will say it's Nolan Smith. Again, I think Maxx Crosby is just as good as Jalen Carter. I don't think the Eagles have anyone as good as Christian Wilkins, right? Now, the Eagles do have a little bit more depth, right? They have Milton Williams. They have Jordan Davis. They have a couple other guys as well. But the Raiders have a pretty damn good defensive line as well. The hope is bring back Adam Butler, you bring back Malcolm Koonce. If Koonce costs more than 12 or 13 million, I think you replace him at that point. And you can still take a defensive end with pick 6 too if you really wanted to, right? If you wanted a cheap DN for 5 years, one that's super, could be a game changer for the Raiders. There's a lot of really good defensive ends in this class. In fact, there's probably going to be a lot of good defensive ends with that second round pick as well. And remember, in the second round, if you're a smart general manager, you draft superstar starters in the second round, the way Tom Telesco did with last year with Jackson Powers Johnson. You take the best guard, you take the best center, you take the best defensive end, defensive tackle. If you take that guy in the second round, chances are those guys are going to be good football players, especially in this class. All right, we'll probably see 1 or 2 guards go in the first round. There's a good chance that arguably the third, fourth best guard, and even you never know because Jackson Powers Johnson wasn't even the first center taken, and he is definitely the best center from last year's class. You never know, right? Which guy's going to end up becoming really, really good at that next level. So you might even get the best guard coming out, right? So the Raiders have so many options. If you do go forward with Matthew Stafford, take a DN, you take a center or a guard, you take a corner, you take a wide receiver, you take a running back. I would hope the Raiders go all in, man. But it does look like they're interested in Matthew Stafford. A lot of reports coming out. I want to know what you guys think about it. Would you be interested in Matthew Stafford? I also heard Sam Darnold's another guy that the Raiders are apparently interested in. I'm personally not as interested in Sam Darnold as I would be with Matthew Stafford. I would even take Aaron Rodgers for 2 or 3 years over Sam Darnold for 5 years. Sam Darnold hasn't really proven much. He had this year, which was a really, really good year. But I do think that Kevin O'Connell, the head coach of the Minnesota Vikings, can find success with multiple different quarterbacks. Just as much success as Sam Darnold had this past season, right? I think he can kind of make it work with different quarterbacks. So let me know what you guys think, man. Thumbs up, subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time with another video.